All right, and welcome back for our fourth week. We only have one to go after this one. Doing an awesome job in this condensed class. Great job on your midterms. The essays were wonderful. Your multiple choice answers were good. We had a really high class average. So great job. So coming up in this week, you have your letter to your representative paper is due. That's due on the 28th, which is Wednesday. So if you don't know what that is, I have a little section in there talking about it. But basically, you're picking an issue, you're writing to your representative, trying to come up with ways to problem solve that issue. Also, this week we're doing mods 10, 11, and 12. And your discussion is about principles of motivation and how well your current teachers are using them. So we're going to jump into these different mods. We'll be talking about motivation. We'll be talking about contextual influences, as well as self-regulated learning. So we're really looking at ways that we can make ourselves and our students want to learn. Learning's not always so exciting, so how do we make it more exciting? Remember, on August 6th, that's it. That's when all of your last assignments are due. So those will be your last couple mods, your final exam, as well as your civics education discussion. So please make sure you're getting all of that done. I don't want you to be scrambling on Friday the 6th and saying, oh my gosh, I still have so much to do. Work ahead if you can. And yeah, great job. Keep sending me your questions, and let's jump into the chapters. All right, so let's hop into mod 10, which is all about motivation. And so I have a slide in here talking about lack of motivation and procrastination and even writing slides sometimes. But I just want you to think about what's a time that you really lacked motivation. Sometimes we let our to-do list pile up and pile up and pile up so much that we don't do any of it. Has that ever happened to you? And so as we think through motivation today, I want you to think about why did that happen to you and what did you do to change it? So the first part of this chapter has to do with attributions. And I have a question. How did you do on your midterm? And why do you think you scored that way? Did you study really hard and you got a great score to show for it? Or did you put it off till the last minute and not study so much and squeak by? And so as we think about attributions, it's really the explanation that we give for why we perform the way we did. And so attributions can be a lot of different things. They can be internal or external. Well, I didn't study because I'm just not good at reading. That's that internal, right? Or, well, I didn't study because I got scheduled a double shift and then I had to see my friend who was in town. Those are external things. Those are out of our control, right? They could be stable or unstable and controllable or uncontrollable, right? So things that always happen to us or some freak thing that we never thought would have happened. Okay? So we're going to think through attributions. You may have heard of an attribution error in the past, and we'll talk about that. Another part of this chapter is our self-concept. So we want to know, like, how motivated are our students to engage in learning? And that has to do with their self-concept. And those change as we move through childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. But younger children tend to be a lot more optimistic. They think they can do anything, they try everything. It's really great. I, as an adult, try to do that myself. I jump into new hobbies and activities all the time, and I'm not so afraid of failure. As we get a little bit older, we start to compare ourselves to other people, and then that fear of failure really starts to set in, and we don't have the best self-concept. Well, I'm good at sports, but I'm not good at drawing, so I'm just not going to try drawing, is what you'll see start to happen. So children who have a self-concept that they are skilled at a certain academic domain are more likely to put more effort into that domain. So, well, I know I'm good at math, so of course I'm going to study, but I'm not good at reading, so I'm just going to not do that. Goals is another part of motivation. We've talked about SMART goals in the past, but learning goals is really important to our motivation. We focus on developing new knowledge and new skills. We set some performance goals. I want to achieve this particular task by this particular date, and that helps make us a little more motivated when we have a goal. Another part of this chapter is growth mindset. So you may have heard of a fixed or a growth mindset. I know with my students, we always talk about having a growth mindset. I can't do it yet, right? I don't know how to tie my shoes. I'll never do it. Fixed mindset. I can never do it. Growth mindset. I don't know how to tie my shoes yet. Okay. When you think about a growth versus a fixed mindset, growth is that something can change. I have the ability to put in effort and learn it eventually. Fixed is I'm either good or I'm not. I know how to tie my shoes or I don't. And so we want to really discourage that fixed mindset. We want to grow and have a growth mindset. With all of these theories of motivation, they have to come from somewhere or somebody. And we really can have this growth or fixed mindset depending on the encouragement we get from the people around us. So some of this is taught explicitly by our parents or our teachers or other members of our community, but we don't always just absorb the information exactly as the teacher or the person telling it to us intended. So children and adolescents really construct a view of the world based on their interpretation of experiences. If they see somebody on TV really having some positive self-talk and overcoming a failure, they absorb that. Next part of this chapter is intrinsic motivation, so motivation from inside. And think about something that you did just because you wanted to. Nobody was paying you for it. Nobody was giving you applause for it. It's just something that you wanted to do. That's intrinsic. So for me, intrinsic motivation would be like playing music. I'm not getting paid to do it. I'm doing it because I like to do it, and I just want to do it. The next part of motivation is extrinsic motivation. So that is because of an external factor. So I made a series of YouTube videos, and the external factor was my students were getting to see those, and different companies were checking them out. And so I was making them because I wanted to. They had music, but then there was this extrinsic motivator on the end of it, and that helped me put one out every day. And when we think about intrinsic versus extrinsic, actually intrinsically motivated things we're more likely to do. Eventually the reward of the extrinsic motivation wears off. And so we want to think about how can we make our students really engage. They want to do it for them. They're not just doing it for the grade. They're not just doing it because their parents tell them to. They're doing it because, wow, I actually love learning. That's that intrinsic motivation. Another part of this chapter is learned helplessness. And this is the idea that we have tried and failed with no support and no encouragement, and we just think, I'm not even going to try anymore. I'm going to fail regardless. I've had students in the past who have had negative teachers or people in their lives telling them they're not good at math. And so rather than even trying a math problem, they'll just say, I can't. I'm just not good at it. I'm not smart enough. And so that's learned helplessness. We just feel like any of our efforts will lead to no success, and so we stop trying. Have you ever felt that way about an academic subject or anything else? What happened? Did you ever break out of it, or have you still avoided it? So think about ways that we can get rid of learned helplessness. We want to motivate, we want to encourage, we want to support and scaffold. There's 3 basic needs that are really important to self-determination theory. And those are the need for competence. So I want to be able to do it and understand it. The need for autonomy. I want to be able to do it on my own. And the need for relatedness, which is we want to connect with people. And we want to be like others. And so these 3 things are really important. And we can really increase our intrinsic motivation if we work through competency, autonomy, and relatedness. Another thing, and I saw a lot of this in your essays, the impact of rewards. Well, I'll just give my students $100 and then I'm sure they'll do the test, or I'll just give them cookies every day. So thinking about rewards, it's a way that we tend to default for motivation. When we think back to behaviorism, right? Do the thing, here's the reward, great job, do the thing again, you might get a reward. These are really built into our academic system, thinking about grades and probations and honor rolls and things like that. However, using rewards can actually backfire in terms of motivational learning. There's a section in your textbook that really talks about how rewards increase motivation, but they can also decrease it. There's been a lot of studies that if, okay, you tell employees, I'm going to give you $50 if you come 50 straight days in a row, it really brings attendance up. But the second they get their reward, attendance goes almost back to where it was, if not lower. And so we want to think about how we use rewards. We've talked about different interval schedules in the past, but when we're doing something just for a reward, it becomes an extrinsic motivator and it really loses a lot of value. You might have seen that happen to you, something that you love to do, whether it's sports or music or drawing, and then when there gets to be a dollar amount or some kind of reward put on it, it doesn't become as fun. It almost feels like a job. And so we want to be careful with rewards. I think that's all we're going to do for the motivation topic. Let's move into Mod 11. All right, so moving into Mod 11, we're talking about self-regulated learning. Really fascinating chapter. A lot of this you probably are doing often. And so with self-regulated learning, we want to know, like, how do we watch ourselves learn? So the first part of this chapter is self-monitoring. And this is a way of keeping track of our behavior, and it could be about health or learning or even relationships. And so we want to talk about, like, how often we're doing it, so frequency. We want to talk about the duration, how long does it last? We want to talk about what is going on and even try and figure out, are there things that happen before we do it and after? And so when we look at self-monitoring, just think about one behavior to focus on. It could be your eating, like a food journal, or your weight, like weighing yourself daily or weekly, or even recording your exercise. And really, we just want to track what we're doing, what's working for us. Maybe you see, wow, every morning that I eat Cinnamon Toast Crunch, I notice I'm really lethargic. And so, I wonder what's contributing to me being tired. We want to review it. We want to figure out what is going on. What's really important to consider with self-monitoring is truthfulness. Honesty is a great policy here. And if you're not being honest, you're probably not going to grow. If you're like, yeah, I studied 4 hours every day and I still got an F on my test, even though you didn't study at all, you're not going to grow from that. Okay, consistency is super important. Just like with eating habits or exercise, we want to regularly track the behavior and do it consistently. You don't want to, on Sunday, be like, what did I have for breakfast the last 10 days? And timeliness. Just make sure you're doing it every day and so you can keep your accurate records. Another part of this is self-instruction. So yes, we have teachers, and just like in this class, you listen to these lectures and you read the book, but what is your ability to teach yourself as well? So how do you go about preparing for this class? You read the book, then you get this lesson, then you do the ARQs, then you take a quiz. Well, this is a form of self-instruction. It's what you do beyond just the lecture to help make this information make sense to you. Self-reinforcement is the next part of this chapter, and this is where we reward ourselves for some of our behavior. So for me, in the past, and maybe as recently as this week, if I'm working on a ton of reports, I will lay out some candy, and when I finish page 20 of the report, I'll eat a piece of candy. And when I finish page 35 of the report, I'll eat another piece of candy. So think about your self-reinforcements. What do you do? Is it some good food or drink after work? Is it, wow, I worked really hard, I'm going to watch Netflix for the next 7 hours? Is it getting out and exercising? What do you do for self-reinforcement? As we've learned a lot about throughout this book, social cognitive influences have a huge impact on our lives and our learning. And so that's the next part of this self-regulated learning. We have self-observation, we have self-judgment, we have self-reaction. And so if you're following along on slide 5 here, have these bubbles of the performance monitoring phase, reflection, forethought, and planning. And we just continue to do that. So we're monitoring our performance, we're putting a strategy in place so that we can learn our task. Then we're going to monitor the effectiveness and monitor our motivation. After we do that performance monitoring phase, we're going to move into the reflection. What did we learn? How did it go? What was our emotional responses? How do we need to manage them? Finally, we go into the forethought and planning phase. We're going to analyze that task, and set goals forward to completing it. And so if you do that with everything, you'll have a pretty good system of self-regulated learning. Coming up next are a couple strategies. And so I have DREMI, distributed practice, retrieval, elaboration, metacognition, and interleaving. So we talked about interleaving a couple chapters ago. Metacognition has been a theme throughout this course. Let's get into these other ones. So distributed practice, I have this cartoon here. I'm cramming before the test and then I forget it all afterwards. Remember, we don't want to cram. We want to space it out over time, study for 20 minutes every day leading up to your final rather than 5 hours the night before. You can set aside time to study, make flashcards, even studying in groups that meet a couple times a week. But the spacing is really important with distributed practice. I have a video that you can click on in Canvas about spaced practice. Next is retrieval. And so we want to have effortful retrieval practice and truly question what you know. Identify what you don't know and practice it. So with this, if you're studying flashcards, don't study them in the same order. Eventually you're going to learn, oh yeah, after that one comes this one every time I know that. Do some different practice testing. Try different methods for studying. Have another great video here for retrieval practice. Elaboration, we've talked about in the past, but how does this connect to my prior knowledge? Explain how this new information you're learning is related to old information. I see a lot of you write in your ARQs like, oh, I learned this in my cognitive psych class, and I remember the teacher taught this lesson about it. That's great. Make those connections and build upon them. You want to create your own examples that are meaningful to you. Then comes elaboration. I have concept mapping in here. Maybe you've done this with writing, but really we want to take an idea and branch it out as far as we can. Remember, the more bridges we have, the better connection. So I'm talking about planets. I have an example here. Here's the sun. Here's all the planets that I can think of. Just keep branching out those concepts. Another part of elaboration is mnemonics. And these are like from math so long ago, you might remember PEMDAS. Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, a way to remember parentheses, exponents, multiplication, division, addition, subtraction, the order of operations. And so mnemonics are just a way that you give yourself a shortcut to remember things. I have a couple different ideas here. So let's move into metacognition. And as we probably remember, it's knowledge and beliefs about our own cognitive processes, as well as a way to regulate those processes so we can really maximize our learning. I have a slide here, slide 17 if you're following along. Schema, making connections, asking questions, synthesizing. Metacognition is this idea of how do I learn best and really watching that process. The metacog style, we're going to look at the task and assess it. We're going to think, okay, what am I really good at? I'm great at highlighting and making flashcards. Then I'm going to plan my approach. Then I'm going to apply my strategies. And afterwards, I'm going to reflect. How did it go? And then when I assess my next task, I'm going to do something similar if it worked or different if it didn't. Interleaving, we've talked a lot about. I do have a video here that's pretty great, so check that out. And that is all we're going to talk about for Mod 11. Let's move into Mod 12. So our last mod for the week is all about context. So this is contextual influences. And we're going to talk about different components that can affect learning, how we make an effective environment for our students, in our classrooms, in our schools, in our communities. Talk about some culturally appropriate practice as well as 4 assumptions. And we'll really talk about how peers, family, communities, and culture can affect learning. So what is context? Context is the community or the learning environment which the individual is located. Okay. So the context for where I'm living currently is very different than where I used to live, and thinking about all the different components from the people to the schools to even the air quality. So this next slide is all about Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory. You may have seen this in other classes and remember it, but it's macro systems, exosystems, mesosystems, and microsystems. And there's a little slide here, but basically The macro is the family or the classroom. And inside of that is the exosystem, which is our friends, our friends of our family, our neighbors. We have our mesosystem, and inside our microsystem is our family, our school, our peers, things like that. So I have a video on this that you can click on as well. Let's talk about effective learning environments. So a couple different things here. Differentiation of task structure, student autonomy, grouping patterns, and performance evaluations. These are all things we want to think about. This is a table in your book, page 465. But basically, let's look at autonomy, right? If students have low autonomy, they have very few choices. If they have high autonomy, they have much more choices. In certain situations, we really want to let our students have a lot more autonomy, and in certain, we want them to have less. So let's talk about classroom management. If you've been in the classroom, this is something you've already dealt with. If you're watching seasoned teachers and you're like, wow, how are they doing that? No, it takes a lot of practice and genuineness. But classroom management is we're setting our expectations and our rules of how we're going to behave in the classroom. We can have proactive management as well as reactive management. And both are really important. And try and think of some ways that have come up in both. Proactive, remember, is setting up the management beforehand. These are our class rules. Raise your hand, don't shout out, we're kind, we share. Reactive is what do you do when one of those rules is broken? How do you then react to it and make sure moving forward things are going to be okay? So think about situations you've been in your classroom, even in your life, where you've set up proactive rules and then also had to set up reactive ones. Next slide I have is target, and not like the store, but task, authority, recognition, grouping, evaluation, and time. And so target variables really affect learning and motivation, depending on what the task is, depending on who the authority figure is, depending on if the student recognizes it, depending on how they're grouped, depending on how I evaluate it, depending on how much time. All of that are really important things that affect learning. Let's talk a little about teacher-student interactions. Feedback is so important. We have performance feedback, we have corrective feedback, we have motivational feedback. And when we're giving performance feedback, it's really important. If we just go, okay, after they present, we're not giving our students anything. We want to say, I love that you did this, and I love that you did this, and next time work on this. We want to keep it brief for our younger students, and we want to reteach and lead students to answers. And give them some short-term tasks. If the big project is a book report, let's have an idea due in the first week, and a rough draft due halfway, and some other things due in between. We want to have some short-term successes to help with that big long-term assignment. With teacher expectations, there can be this thing called a self-fulfilling prophecy, which is students' achievement is going to come to reflect the teacher's expectations. If you walk into your classroom and you're like, oh man, this is a bad class, nobody is going to do well, it's way too hard, your students will live up to that expectation. They will fulfill that prophecy. And so we want to develop high and strong expectations for our students. We want to treat students based on those expectations. I like to walk into every year and think, this is going to be a great year. And yeah, there will be ups and downs, but we're going to all get through it. And that's the expectation I want you to set in your classroom, that you can achieve if you just try with that growth mindset. Students might reflect and react differently on differential treatment. And so we really want to make sure we're being aware of our biases, and we're treating students with respect and treating everyone how they should be treated. Really good way to do that is to enforce fair and consistent rules. These are my rules. I stick to them. I don't make exceptions because you were saying whatever you said today. So we want to show that we're fair and consistent. Super important. We want to assume all students can learn, and we want to convey that to them. We want to really curb that idea of this learned helplessness of a student who's saying, I'm not good enough, I'll never be able to do it, I'm not smart, I don't try that stuff. All of our students can learn, all of our students can grow, and all of our students can achieve. We don't want to accept excuses for poor performance and really realize that upper limits of abilities are pretty unknown. It's scary for us to push ourselves and get into a space we haven't attempted before. And so, as a teacher, we want to do that for our students. We want to let them know it's safe to try, and yeah, you can achieve great things. Next, I want to talk about developmentally appropriate instruction. And you, you all know this, we've talked about it, but really matching our learners' developmental levels with our instruction. Okay. And so, thinking about the four assumptions, we've got students construct knowledge based on their prior experiences and present schemas, like constructivism used to say. The social environment is so important, like our friend Vygotsky says. Conflict is created when the material is beyond the student's present understanding. That's our zones of proximal development we've talked about. And finally, we want to incorporate active exploration and hands-on activities, like Bruner said we should. So those are ways to really create a developmentally appropriate instruction. Let's talk about classroom and school climate. If you've been in buildings, you know that this is a very big and real thing. So our climate is our atmosphere or our tone or our culture associations with the classroom or school environment. I have been in buildings before in classrooms where the climate is not great. And that's because maybe teachers are upset or students are misbehaving because their teachers didn't set good ground rules in the classroom. And when a teacher is upset, that really comes down on the students. They're very in tune with that, and things don't go so well. So our community is the individuals' feelings that they belong in a group and are committed to that group's goals. In some classrooms I've worked in, we'll make a contract of rules, and everyone gets to contribute and everybody signs it. And now we're this community. This is our community. We all follow these rules, and there's just a lot more accountability within that connected peer group. We want to have relational trust, and that's between teachers and admin and students. Finally, safety and security. Physical and psychological safety are both so important. The next part of this chapter is peers and really thinking about who are our students around, who are their peers. We want to think about school adjustment. Poor adjustment can really lead to dropping out, and that could be from an academic standpoint or from a social standpoint. Both of those we can poorly adjust to. We could have anxiety around our grades or loneliness around our friendships or lack social and academic support and motivation and just not continue with school. So we want to be really aware of the peer groups that our students are with. When we think about families, socioeconomic status is a topic in this book, and that is parental income as well as education and occupation, and really just like the money component, financial and material resources, education resources, social resources, being really aware of what our families are lacking and needing. Learning is another important piece of families. Poverty and lower parental education are related to more poorly developed learning and development, and early intervention is really key. So if we have a household where there are no books in the household, nobody is talking to the child, nobody is reading with the child, versus a household where there are tons of books and tutors and extracurricular educational activities, you're going to see a real discrepancy in learning. And so we want to be aware of what our families need. I have a video here from Dr. James Comer on school development programs. And so check that out. Really interesting study. He founded the Yale Child Study Center. So super cool guy. As we finish up this chapter, there's a couple slides here on electronic media. iPads and computers are so prevalent in our students' learning now. And while it's a great gateway to a ton of information, we really want to try and moderate viewing, as well as, if you can, have some parental co-viewing. There's just so much on the internet that is not helpful, and we want to make sure we're in the right place for our students and they're looking at the right stuff. Communities and culture. We want to consider the school's geographic location and really what is around and nearby in that community? Are there boys and girls clubs? Are there after school programs? Are there libraries? Are there places that students can feel psychologically and physically safe while also being educationally stimulated? With a lot of research, you'll see that it applies to US children. And so I don't want you to assume that those findings just applying to US children apply to children from all cultural backgrounds. Think about the difference between individualism culture and a collectivism culture, right? This idea of we do it all for ourselves versus we do it all for the family and the people around us. So these findings that you may see that only apply to US children don't extend to other cultures. And the last thing I want to talk about in this chapter are learning styles. And know that they're just preferences, they're not really styles, not how you learn, but it's how you like to learn. And I have a link here to an NPR story about the difference. Like, you think you're an auditory or a visual learner, and scientists saying that it's unlikely. And so check that story out. And otherwise, I look forward to reading your papers, and great job.